and in water law. And water is also a critical issue throughout my district.
Yeah, so I want to talk about the Oregon 2nd Congressional District then. So this is just an enormous part of Oregon. When you look at the map, it just looks like it's practically the whole state. And this is one of 6 districts in Oregon?
One of 5, actually.
5, okay.
And the 2nd Congressional District is roughly the size of the state of Missouri, for those folks who want kind of a perspective on it. So it is very large. It's one of the largest in the country. And as folks know, congressional districts are drawn up by population. Mm-hmm. And so that it kind of lets you know that it's a primarily rural district. But great folks, incredible people, pragmatic, good-hearted people, regardless of party affiliation throughout the district. The other thing, though, with party affiliation, we're seeing in my district, which is more kind of independent-minded, somewhat libertarian-leaning, even if they do have an R or a D after their name. But the majority of folks in my district are actually non-affiliated or not, or registered with a third party, so not registered as Republicans or Democrats. It's about 40% of the district. 40% is either non-affiliated or another party, independent or third party. About 35% are registered Republicans and about 25% registered as Democrats.
And so I was looking, and it looks like the incumbent has been in office for 20 years, nearly 20 years. And before him, as far back as I could trace, there was also a Republican congressperson. So if the district is somewhat independent-leaning, what explains this propensity for voting for Republicans for so long?
Well, if we looked at the last several cycles, his competition was he hasn't had competition by someone who had political experience or had run campaigns before. And so it didn't make for a very competitive race. The other thing is that there were not egregious things that were happening in our country that were really drawing people's attention to it. And so the congressman that I'm running against, Greg Walden, led the attack or the attempt to repeal the ACA, and actually led the effort in the House of Representatives to repeal the ACA. That actually went forward. It did. The Senate, of course, with John McCain's famous no vote, stopped it from going forward. But that was the effort that he led. What's shocking about that is that if the ACA, our healthcare Affordable Care Act, was repealed in its entirety, nearly 20% of my district would be without health care, would lose health care. And my district would have been the hardest hit in the country. So we're talking about almost 135,000 people in my district would have lost health care if the repeal had gone through. People know that, especially folks in most rural areas know that, because a lot of them did not have health care before the ACA. So that is a huge issue for people throughout my district. Also, just the lack of standing up and addressing issues of concern. The tariff war that the president now has us in is going to have a devastating impact on our ag sector. And these are not issues that our representatives standing up for and speaking out on. And so people in the district, including Republicans, are really frustrated and angry. The perception, you mentioned his longevity, but the perception of that is that he's really lost his way and lost his focus in the district. And that's when congressmen have been replaced in the past in my district. The other one thing, I'll say this specifically because your show is about two broads talking politics, is that my district has never been represented by a woman. It's 125 years. So I like to say that if our district has a tradition of strong, hardworking women, and after 125 years, it's time we were represented by one.
So you won the primary already. Oregon's already had its primary, and it was a pretty crowded primary field, and you got a big percentage of the vote. So how do you campaign in a district like that is just so enormous? How do you make sure that your message gets out there and people know who you are and what you stand for?
Showing up is key, and I've been doing this full time for the past year and traveling around in my Jeep and teardrop trailer. I'm actually sitting in my teardrop right now with my dog. We're going to be hitting the road a little bit later, but I traveled in all 20 counties last year, and even, build up before the end of last year, and then really focused on the more voter-rich areas leading up to the primary. It was a contested race with some really great competition, really great individuals who all brought different skill sets to the table, and all of them have come on board and are endorsing my race to replace Greg Walden. So that part has been really positive to the point of getting out. It's getting out, it's showing up, it's meeting with folks. The other thing is really the focus. I like to talk about Oregon values, and some of these things, I'm sure carry across the country, but for us in Oregon, I'll talk about Oregon values being the fact that we all care about our families and we all care about our communities, regardless of party affiliation. And we actually have some really remarkable traditions here in Oregon of folks coming across party lines to work together and solve really challenging community problems by getting together and working on it together. And so that's really my focus. The other key thing, and I think this is key really for politics in general, but especially in rural areas, is to be very careful with language. Our politics has become more divisive than ever, and we have buzzwords, both sides, that either inflame people either way, either start up or shut down conversations. And so I like to focus on talking about ideas rather than buzzwords. So for example, on healthcare, I'll talk about 4 ideas. I'll say the first is I believe everyone should have access to a full range of physical and mental health care. The second point is I believe we should manage costs. The third is we need to maintain a high quality of care. And the fourth is that we need to provide care for caregivers. To that second point of managing costs, one of the ways, and I'm open to discussing all ways we can manage costs, but one of the ways we can manage costs is to look at and move towards a single payer healthcare system, because that way we can save essentially 25% of the costs we're now seeing that goes into some of the private insurance that gets caught up in that sector. But if I start up by just talking about single payer, it shuts down the conversation for some folks who don't feel comfortable with that or will refer to that as socialized medicine. But if we talk about the ideas, I've had folks who even have referred to single payer as socialized medicine. We talk about the ideas. They'll think that those ideas are pretty good because of the opportunities through that method or that system of managing our healthcare. The other thing, frankly, is if other folks can bring other ideas for ways we can manage costs and still provide healthcare to everyone, I'm more than happy to have that conversation and listen, because I really want to get to what are the best ideas for everyone and not get caught up on the buzzwords.
So you talked some about this divisiveness. What kind of reception have you gotten when you've been out talking to people? You just mentioned that they might like some of these ideas of healthcare. Has the overall reception been pretty positive? Are people skeptical? How are people actually sort of viewing not just your campaign, but sort of the idea of thinking about Congress and government in general?
I see looks of relief on people's faces. So we're going into the fair season again, but last year I went around and did the fair circuit and the powwow circuit throughout my district. And, I could talk, as a rural Democrat, I could be talking to, conservative Republicans who are wearing the big red Make America Great Again caps, and we would talk about these ideas and we could find common ground. And it goes back to this concept of how do we set the stage so we can care for our families and care for our communities. The challenge I always set for myself is to try to find something that we could agree on. And often it came down to talking about our kids or, their grandkids. I'm a stepmom, so I appreciate the challenges of, people are working really hard to get by and care for their families. And that's the work of politics, is to help set the stage so that people can do that, do their work safely and provide care for their families and their communities. So one of the things one of my kind of lines I like to use is government needs to know when to help out, when to get out of the way. And I really believe that, because folks don't want too much government in their lives, but they also want government to create enough structure to keep us safe and to provide us with opportunities.
One of the things that you talk about on your website with your values is gun safety measures. And this is obviously an area that has created a lot of tension and divisiveness. And presumably the people of rural Oregon, many of whom are going to be gun owners and use guns, how have you been able to approach that issue in a way that people can relate to and come to agreement on?
Yeah, well, I'll start out by by talking about how it's important to keep our kids safe in schools and our families safe. And that's something that goes across the board. I'll also recognize our hunting tradition. So my dad hunted to put food on the table. And I think a lot of, most of the folks in my district have guns and for the purposes of hunting or maybe protecting their family. And so then the question becomes, how can we move forward and keep our community safe? And I think a perfect example for me was an experience I had with a young man in Klamath Falls, which is southern part of the district, very red, very rural part of my district. And I was chatting with him last November, and this was just after the horrific shooting in Las Vegas, when there was discussion of bump stock legislation. And, we were talking first about politics in general, and he was saying that, complaining about Democrats always wanted to take people's guns away and concerns about how Democrats approach politics. And so we were talking about safety issues. And, he's a dad and he's got kids in the home. And so, of course, he's concerned about gun safety. And I was asking him about the bump stock legislation that had been proposed at that time. And he said he thought it was really a bad idea. It was really bad legislation. And so I asked him, I said, do you think we don't need bump stock legislation? And his response to me really struck me, because he said, of course we need bump stock legislation, but the way it was written was really stupid, because all you have to do is make one small tweak to your weapon and it doesn't apply to you. So it's really stupid legislation. He said how that legislation should have been written was, and then he rattled off a list of probably 10 things that should have been in that bill and were being advocated by him, an avid hunter and gun owner. And what that really drove, the message that was really driven home to me was the fact that we have to sit down together and figure this stuff out. And what I think has traditionally happened, or this is at least the perception of what's happened, is you have one side that says no guns, and then you have the other side that says guns without limits. And that's the shouting match. And the vast majority of people are in the middle, many of who are gun owners, who are responsible gun owners, who want sensible legislation to keep their families and communities safe as well. And we would need to come together and have this conversation about how we can keep our community safe. And polls will show that I think it's like 85% of folks believe in sensible gun safety legislation. So we have to have that national debate over what that looks like. And then we have to be able to move forward and establish some legislation that is this common sense legislation, and do other things as well. Work on mental health issues and make sure there's mental health care. Work on some of these other opportunities. That's really the direction that I believe we need to go, because when we get too extreme one way or the other, it closes down that opportunity to move forward. The other thing, and something I've proposed in terms of specifically for school safety, is a school safety grant program that money would be given to school districts, and the school districts could decide how to spend it. 'Cause I'm a big fan also of local wisdom and folks who know their communities well, knowing how to best meet big picture goals and policy issues, but figure out how to implement them at the local level. And so the school districts would figure out how to best implement those safety programs at the local level. And I've spoken to some teachers and school board members who said they would have a harder campus. Other teachers and school board members who said they would hire more school counselors, because that's what would help keep kids safe. So I think we have to really focus on the big picture of safety, and then have a broader conversation of how we accomplish it, and look at all the options and look at all the ideas on the table and really move forward on those things, in an open-minded way. I think the frustration that comes from a lot of gun owners is that there's just kind of a one-size-fits-all approach. The other thing that I've heard from veterans is a real frustration. There's not a distinction between military and civilian-grade weapons, and have the distinction be drawn, and have legislation and have appropriate restrictions on different types of weapons. Military-grade weapons, there's certain training that needs to be in place, and certain, it's not. There's a distinction, and there should be different rules for military-grade weapons, I believe, and I've heard this from a lot of veterans as well.
One other area that I wanted to be sure to ask you about was the environment. So such a huge swath of Oregon that your district covers includes a lot of